Good morning, everyone. This is Patrick Halstead at Qdabra Software, and I'm really happy to be presenting to you today. Today we're talking about best practices for designing your form's data source. And I want to just start off with a couple minor announcements here. First off, last week we sent out this Q alert. I don't know if you got it or not, but it will be included in the package. You can click on these links. Suffice it to say that Microsoft has announced with their SharePoint Server 2016 release that they're extending InfoPath Form services not until 2023 as we thought, but actually until 2025 or 2026. And what's interesting is they're supporting the designer, the InfoPath designer and filler. Even though they're not shipping in SharePoint Server 2016, they will be supporting those client software until 2026. So that was the news last week. We sent out the announcement, and you can get the links in the presentation. Also, last week we did a Power BI presentation webinar. First one we did, it was kind of a little rough, but if you guys have got reporting needs, obviously you're getting your data, your business process is collecting data, and we're going to talk about data today. But check out last week's webinar if you want to create a report. We can also help you set it up. Just send an email to support@qdabra.com. Here's the kind of an example. You can take your data from a list, you can take your data from a database or from an Excel spreadsheet, and you can quickly, of course, make these generic dynamic UIs on SharePoint 365. Okay, and then lastly, we have our training class February 23rd. We're going to do it this next month, and we really would love to have you in it. It's about 20 hours of training. Comes with all the content, all the videos, with the free tool or renewal if you've already got it, and you can click there to register. Okay, so with no further ado, then I'd like to do a quick survey just to gauge people's awareness of what we're going to talk about today, which is the data source. And I'll just run this quick survey. Just launching it right now here. So we've got a few questions here. Look at your data source in your InfoPath form, because that's what we're talking about today, and tell me real quick, you can actually check more than one here. So do you have good hierarchical tree structure? Yes, we have that. And do you have well-named fields? What about repeating groups? Are you doing those correctly? We're going to talk about those today. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just hang tight. But if you can quickly answer these, we'll get a kind of a rough idea of whether or not people have renamed their root node. We'll talk about that today. So these are some of the topics, some of the things that it looks like about half of you, about 38%, 42% voted, and it looks, I'll give another 3 or 4 seconds here, 62%, we're up to 62%, going once, 65%. Okay, so it looks like most of you have well-named fields, 95%. 63% of you have consistently good data types, and 58% good hierarchical structure, 53%, obviously this is hitting a pain point here for you, repeating groups and non-repeating, and then the worst one here is root node. Only 26% of you have renamed your root node. Well, thanks for playing the poll. This is just to get our eyes and to get our awareness around what we're going to talk about today. So the agenda, we're going to talk about what good data source hygiene is, and we call that schema. We're going to talk about repeating groups because they can be tricky. InfoPath is a sharp knife. You don't want to cut yourself. We're going to also talk about what happens when you need to update your form and what happens when it's a big update. And we'll show you some techniques. We'll talk about techniques for migrating old data. So number one, I know most of you are aware, but the number one pitfall of InfoPath, and it's always been this way, has been the data source. People do not create a good data source, and it kind of it's kind of sad because you go to all this trouble to create a form, and then you can't report on it because your data source is just junk. It's like field 1, field 2, you know what I mean? So the data source is really important for reporting, and it's also important for downstream line of business processes. If you want to move your data to SQL or to some other process, it's important that those fields and groups be named correctly. So let's review here. What is a data source? Well, it's kind of like the floor plan for your house. It's a schematic that encodes information about that form, that data collection event. So in general, as humans, we live somewhere, we follow this schema for our address in the United States. Name, address 1, address 2, line 1, line 2, whatever, city, state, zip code, right, and maybe country. If we encode the data as you see below, it's not evident what the zip code is. Is it 13457 or 44888? Well, of course, those of you who live in Maryland probably know. But my point is that you need to follow a structure when you're dealing with computers. In spite of the wonderful AI that we have now that plays Go, I guess Facebook and Google both announced yesterday that they have new AIs that are really good at playing the game of Go, which is a lot harder than checkers apparently for computers. In spite of this advent of AI, computers still need schemas, right? They still need structure. Here's an example of an InfoPath form with the root node named correctly, asset tracking, right? This was Microsoft's asset tracking form that shipped in, I think it was 2003. I worked on that form actually, my team did at Microsoft. So we've got the root node, that's the top node. We talk about groups, those are the folders that you see there. There's a repeating group, there's a little blue thing underneath it, that's your indication that's repeating, and then you have fields. Now in addition, if you add a field to a field, it's not going to be a field, it's going to be an attribute. We're just going to ignore those. If you guys have a question on that, feel free to add a question. But for the purpose of this quick webinar, we're going to ignore that because it's not really a big deal. Attributes, you can use them if you want, but they're not a huge scenario. So in general, what you're going to do is you're going to create the data source manually. That's the best practice, and that's going to force you then to create your nodes. So when I say create it manually, what do I mean? Well, you're going to start your designer, you're going to create your form, and instead of going to the controls, as you maybe want to do, you may want to just quickly start dragging and dropping controls into your new form. I would say don't do that. What you should do is you should come over here first and you should say this is my new form. So this is my, we're going to call it, I don't know, customer support. And then underneath here, you're going to add your groups. So we'll have customer info, say, make this a group. And then underneath that customer info, obviously I don't need to say customer over and over again, but we're going to have the name and so forth, the full name of the customer. And what you want to do is you want to be consistent. So if you're using camel casing and you're always under lowercasing the first character, be consistent with your field names as well. It doesn't really matter whether you use camel casing with lowercase for the first character or not. Do whatever you want. Just be consistent. Now, notice that when I'm in here, actually, let me go back to my slides first. Okay, so you're going to want to do this, and when you're adding those nodes, you need to indicate whether they're text fields or date fields or so on. And you're just going to do that. Now, once you've added the fields to your form, let's add a couple more actually, and I'm going to actually add a history. So, of course, if you do have XML template parts, like we have a change history, you can add that here. That's easy. And that's going to add both the view and the schema. In this case, we've created an XML template part that has a nice, well-formed schema. In other words, named correctly with a repeating group under a non-repeating parent and yada, yada. So if you have, once you've created a nice section, you can actually give it to people and you can be assured that as long as it's an XML template part, they will add it and they will not have issues with the naming because you've already named it for them, like we see here. What I want to show you though next is I want to talk about what happens when you try to change something. So when you're working on your obviously you've added these fields to your form, you want to add them to your view. And let's just go ahead and show you how to do that. So typically what you're going to do is you're going to create a table in here, like just some kind of a layout table. And then what you'll do is you'll drag these guys over like that. And then you can configure them in the view. If you don't want them to be text fields, you can change the control to be a drop-down and so on. So by adding them first to the data source and then dragging them over, you're ensured of getting a good name, a good data type, consistent naming, and then you can add them to your view. So this is different from the typical practice of just going up to the Home tab and just dragging and dropping controls willy-nilly into your form, like for example, like this. If I click here underneath that and text box, you can see it's going to add field 1. It's not going to put it in the right location. It's not going to give it a good name. So you don't want that. You don't want to take the default. You want to actually use a good naming convention. So what we're going to do is we're going to say we're going to add the data first to the data source and then drag and drop it to our, and notice that if it doesn't select the whole row, it just drags to that cell. So if you have a table, you want to make sure it selects the whole row. Okay, so that's how you create your data source very quickly. Sometimes you actually need to change something. So for example, if you need to change the name of phone to something else, you can right-click on this. You can go in here and you can say, actually you can click on the little drop-down and click on Properties, or right-click on it, click on Properties. You can change it to phone number. That's a different name, right? Now it's not going to complain because I haven't published the form. But if I've published the form and I go up there to change something, it will complain. Let me show you another example. So in the case of this next demo, I'm going to show you the two different versions of customer issue forms, very simplistic forms here. But if I go in and change this, let's say change it to V3, the root node I'm going to change, well, that's going to cause a large migration event. Basically what that means is that all of those old forms that were stored with the customer issues V2 root node will not be openable if I change the name. So it's giving me this warning, and you do not want to click yes here. You want to just back off, leave it. We'll talk about the migration in a second. In general, when you're making changes to your form, it's okay to make additions, but if you're moving your form, if you're moving fields or renaming fields or changing the name of them, that's a big change, okay, so be careful. Now, you can create another field with the same name. Some of you already know how to do this. Let's say, for example, that I actually wanted to create I wanted to actually use my full name underneath the group where I have my support personnel. So we'll say internal info, and we'll make this a group. And I want to actually copy, let's get rid of this field 1 here. We don't want that. And notice because I haven't published, it's not going to complain too badly. So now, let's say I want to copy, or I want to create another name underneath internal info for the support person that's going to contact them. If I just type it in here, it's going to complain. It's going to say, wait a minute, that field already exists. So, and then it tells you exactly what to do, but nobody ever reads this. If you want to create a field with the same name as an existing, right-click, click reference, yada, yada. Let's do that. So right-click, choose reference, and internal info, and voila. Now I have 2 fields in my form with the same name. They're actually separate. They're distinct. They're using the same data type, but they're distinct. Okay, so that's how you do that. Some people ask, so I like to talk about it. Finally, when we're talking about data source, you don't want to have a data source that has repeating structures hard-coded in your form. And here on the left, you see we've got question 1, 2, 3, and we even have question 2 mistyped here. This creates a very hard-coded data source. We can only have 3 questions in our survey, right? Don't do that. Use repeating structures. InfoPath gives you this knife, the sharp knife. You can create a repeating structure. This will handle a variable number of questions and modules. And then to force yourself into this habit, I like to use the default values. It's not the default values is not a final solution, but it's a good start. So as you start to create your schema, use the default values to add sample data in here. And that'll just be a good guide to you when you're previewing it to show you the kind of data that will go in those fields. It'll also force you to not fall into the habit of using the same hard-coded names for your repeating groups. Okay, so good schema hygiene is about a well-organized file cabinet, and that's true for your forms as well. You want to make sure that those forms, your data sources, have groups, fields underneath groups. You do not want everything at the root node. If you're looking at your data source right now, if it's longer than, if you're having to page through it, it's probably too long, right? Most data sources should be less than 200 fields, And if it's more than 200 fields, you're probably hard coding some stuff. You're not normalizing your data. So just follow these best practices. With repeating groups, now notice, if I go back to my simple sample that I was developing here, if I go in and add a repeating group up above, for example, a repeating table, you'll notice that it's going to automatically add to the right group 2 underneath group 1. Now, of course, you want to rename these to make sure you're following good naming practices. But notice what InfoPath does. When you add a repeater, it adds it underneath a non-repeating parent. Now, why does it do that? Well, it's actually really important for reporting. In order to tell when you're done with repeating group, you need to have it in a parent group. So you can't have, if you have, for example, something after a repeating group, and you don't know how many there are in there, then there are issues with trying to iterate over the data source. So it's kind of an esoteric reason, but believe me, you do not want to do the following. You don't want this group 2 node to be, for example, under like this. You do not want this, because if you now have some group node after, let's say, some field, hello world, afterwards, the problem is if you try to access this hello world with a rule or with one of our QRules commands, you can't do it because it doesn't know how many group 2s are intervening. And that's why we want to put group 2 underneath group 1. And if you don't have, if you've created things by yourself, you may indeed have a situation where you've got repeating groups underneath next to other fields that should not be. They should be underneath the non-repeating parent group. Sorry. Okay, so repeating groups should be underneath a non-repeating parent group. Now, and you should not have repeating fields. So one of the things I see a lot is people will have like a repeating field here. Well, this is the same issue, right? If I make this repeating, you'll see that the little blue mark now is going to show up next to field. Same issue as I just mentioned. We don't know how many field 2s there are, so it's almost impossible to access field 3. It is impossible using rules. So you don't want to do that. Whenever you have a repeating group or field, make sure it's just in a repeating. If it's a repeating field, it should be in a repeating group, and it should not be repeating, just like you see what Microsoft does by default here. Okay, so that's a little bit complex, but once again, you can do it. There are a huge problem out there, and just make sure that when you're adding them that you follow the best practice, which is what Microsoft InfoPath supports out of the box. Okay, and if you've got questions, feel free to throw those into the question wheel. We're going to be answering those at the end. If you make small changes to your form, let's say you published your form a year ago, you got to make some changes, you want to add a few nodes, not a problem. Your form is set to automatically upgrade if it's a browser form. If it's a filler form, this is also the default. It'll automatically upgrade. To find out, obviously, everyone's going to have this set to automatic, but you can check yourself. You can go into the form options where it says versioning, and here's where you can determine it. Now, if you have people using the filler, the InfoPath filler client, they're not using the browser forms, you can actually change this to do nothing. And the problem is that those old forms won't work, won't necessarily, they'll open, but they won't add those new fields or those new areas. And so if people can't type in the new data. So if you went into your form and you like say, okay, I want to add this new group 1 here, I want to be able to collect the back and forth with the customer. Actually, I've already got change history, but let's say you wanted to add a new section to your form to for example, maybe categorize the support ticket or something. So you have a taxonomy section or something, and there's multiple tags. So let's call this tags, and then will be tag, and then of course we don't need 3 of them. So this is the name of the tag. Okay, so if we do this and we want to then upgrade our form, so we've published it out there, people have been filling out the form, and a year goes by and then, okay, let's add a tag here. Okay, so we can add this group and repeating name field, not a problem, and then Old forms will automatically have that added when they get reopened if they're in the browser. And if they're in the filler, they will if you've got that setting. So that's really easy. You don't need to worry about upgrades. But keep in mind that if you have to change something, it will break. So like we saw earlier, if we actually publish this form out and then change something in the form, for example, if we change the name of one of these fields, it's going to give us this warning, and that's your cue. Don't do it. Don't change it, just back off, and that's when you want to talk about a bigger change. So we'll talk about that in a second. But for small changes, very easy. Just add fields or add groups, not a problem. The forms will automatically upgrade. Okay, so now let's make a big change. So now we're at the precipice, and we have published our form 2 years ago. We've collected 3,000 forms, and we actually realized that everything is named incorrectly. We've got field 1, field 2, field 3, and group 1, group 2, and it's just a complete mess, and our boss is mad at us because we can't report in the data because we don't know how to do it. Well, there's a couple options here. So the first option I'm going to show you a demo of, which is to publish the form side by side. So I have a SharePoint site up here. Let's go to my SharePoint site. And in this library, I have actually two different kinds of forms. I've got my version 1 and I've got my version 2. So version 1 of this form is really simple. It's just customer issues, right? And you can notice that if I click on the version 2, I get a completely different form, right? So how did we do this? So what you're going to do is you're going to actually, you get your old form in a library, and you're going to have thousands and thousands of forms, not like me, I've only got 2, but you're going to have, publish your old form to the library, thousands of forms. You're going to go to library settings, and you're going to go to advanced settings, and the first thing you're going to do is you're going to enable content types. So because what we want to do is we want to publish the forms side by side. Old form exists alongside new form, and that allows us to have people open the old form, and of course they can open the new form. So you're going to, first of all, you're going to enable this, because by default it's going to be no. And then after you've done that, you'll come back to settings and you'll add the content type. And as you can see here, I've added content type customer issues v2. And we have training on this. We've talked about this in the past quite a bit. But in general, you're going to have a document library where these live. They can't live in the library where you have the form. And so if I click on this, it'll tell me where it lives, and I can go in and I can edit it using the master course form template. So I've got it underneath the form templates document library. And you can edit the template here, and it'll just open it in InfoPath Designer, and that's how you get to it. But what we want to do here is we want to basically change the order. So once you've added the new version, which is v2 in this case, you want to disable the v1 from being the default, and you also want to disable v1 from being available to users, because you don't want people filling it out with the old version. So if we go back here, if I click on new, it's going to open v2, right? It's not going to open v1. And if I click on files, I don't have the option here of going through and doing the new document. I've only got v1, right, or v2. I've only got that. So the reason why is because I went in and I configured those content types to make v2 the default and to hide v1. But v1 is here. So if I click on Qdabra issues, I still get v1. So this is a really good technique. It's simple. The schemas can be completely different. Let's take a look at these schemas, these data sources. So for v1, here's my data source, right? It's customer issues. That's the name of the root node. And, it's got contact block, and it's got a repeating structure here for the issues. And let's take a look at v2. So v2, oops, this is not v2. Okay, so here's v2. Well, v2 looks remarkably similar. However, notice that the root node is completely different. Anyway, the schema is different completely, and it does work side by side. Now, there are a couple of things you want to be careful about. First of all, when you're creating that v2, make sure that you change the name to v2 before you publish as a content type, because if you leave it as v1 and you publish as a content type, those old forms we'll try to open up with a new content type because it's the same name. So you have to make sure the name is different. The other thing that is a bit tricky is in the promoted properties, you're going to be mapping those promoted properties to site columns on your SharePoint site. And you can see here that it's set up to do that, and I'm using the site column for the name. If you publish it, it'll ask you at the end of the publish process, do you want to map these? And you have to be careful because the default is it'll automatically create a site column, and so you end up with a huge proliferation of site columns, which you do not want. So you want to make sure that you're mapping to the same site columns. And I know I didn't really go over that in detail. I didn't show you how to do it, but it's part of the publish process. If we publish this out here as a content type, I'm just going to choose the default here. You'll see there's the site content. You definitely want to publish it out and select site content type for V2. And then you have to specify where you want the form to live. It's very different from a form library, and then here's where you actually specify the site columns. And notice that the default is to create a new one. That's none. So obviously I've already done this, but if I create a new one here, if I add a new one, the default is I need to specify what I want to map. So let's just go up here to, well, it doesn't really matter, but so you can see here that the default is to create a new site column. You don't necessarily want that. You want to go in here and select Microsoft InfoPath, Office InfoPath, and then it's going to show you all the columns that already exist. And notice, this has happened before. We've proliferated the names in the phones because somebody went with the default. So definitely be careful when you're doing that mapping, and that is the tricky part of the publishing side-by-side, is that you've got two things pointing at the same site column. Just make sure that you use the same site column for both of them, and that is one of the challenges there. So anyway, very easy to do. Side-by-side is low cost, is out of box. Highly recommend it. The cons, of course, is that they're going to see two different versions, and reporting, you're going to have to use two different reports. Well, you can use one report on that library or the list, right, because you can still have the same columns. If you're mapping to the same site columns, you can have one report, one Power BI report on top of that library. But if you need repeating data and so forth, that's not going to work. So here's some options. I'm just going to talk through these quickly for the purpose of time. There are some options for migrating old data. So the first option I want to mention is you can map the data from that old form to a list or a number of lists. You can have repeating lists, of course. You can have one parent list and a child list. We have a tool that allows you to map the data from your old form from your old forms, and it's a batch tool. So it'll run ka-chunk through all thousands of your forms. You don't have to actually do it manually. And then you can add a tool or a rule to your new forms to dynamically map those to the list. So the benefit here is that you can have all that data mapped to one list, and you can report on it, and you don't have to worry about doing the site column mapping, and you don't have to worry about publishing content types. The con is, of course, you do need to set up sort of the parent-child relationship when you have repeating data. It's not hard, and you can do that. We also have the ability to map to a database. So you could map all the data out to a list or a number of lists or a database table or a number of tables, and then you can have access to the data. Another technique is to copy the data. So you have a form, your new form opens, and you have a drop-down. You say, okay, specify the old form. So they go off to the old document library, they specify it. It pulls in the old form, queries that data from the library of the old form, and then you use rules to set the values for the new form. So you basically just copy the data over. Now this is totally doable, out of box, right? And you can upgrade basically the form by doing it, but it's manual. So it's like one after another, you have to do it, right? I mean, obviously the rules aren't manual, but the person's going to have to open up each form and do it, and that could be a long slog. Another approach here is to have them open the old form, click on a link, the link then opens a new form, passes a parameter to the new form opens, automatically copies the data in. It basically removes the need for them to have to select it. So it's slightly more natural, but once again, you're going to have to write some rules and potentially have a mapping file, an XSLT transform file to do the mapping. Now, the final technique to migrating old data is to use our tool. We've got a tool called the Document Migration, DBXL Migration Tool. It's a free tool. It comes with the free trial of DBXL. You install DBXL, free trial, and then you create this, install the tool, and then you can actually transform data from one schema to another. And this will do it automatically in batch. So it'll take 100,000 forms and it'll transform them. Now you do have to specify a transformation file, which is a little bit advanced, but we can help you do that. It only takes a half an hour or an hour to create these things. They're not that complex. They're XSLT files. Once you have that, that's your mapping from old to new. Then you just run the tool, and it's going to go through and transform all of them. And then you can have all the old data in the new format. Okay, so those are some techniques, and I'm sorry I don't have time to demo these in detail, but just wanted to show you those techniques. Okay, questions? Let's see, Michael, thank you for asking our first question here. Might be a little off topic, but I received a question from a coworker today, just don't know the answer. Work for a large government agency, and we are still using SharePoint 2010 with a plan to migrate 20 to 2013 later this year. How will the filler forms be impacted if we move to the cloud for SharePoint 2013 and beyond? Great question, Michael. Thank you for being here. So, first of all, we have installed 2016 Office with the 2013 filler side by side, and things work fine. So about a year ago, when they came out with this plan to support InfoPath 2013 with Office 2016, there was a bug. Preview it, didn't work. It tried to uninstall InfoPath, but that bug has been fixed, and we actually have side-by-side installations working now with 365. So the 2013 filler will definitely work with the Office 365. If you're moving to the cloud and you're using 365, that's no issue. If you have your own cloud and you're using 2013 in the cloud, and obviously 2013 will work with the 2013 filler. It's only an issue when you have the 2016, which is the default for 365 now. So hopefully I answered your question, Michael. Anyway, thank you for being the first. So next question from Marlon. Can we use this tool to transfer data from a list to a form library? That's a great question. So the DBXL migration tool is meant to transform XMLs to other XMLs. So it doesn't transform list data, but it would be easy to take the list data that you have. So for example, go into your list, export it as an Excel file, and then attach a schema to the Excel file, and you'll essentially have a form, have the XML. So you can save Excel as XML data, and that might be one way to do it, is to use Excel to do it. Now we have another tool called Excel to InfoPath, which will allow you to take an Excel spreadsheet or multiple worksheets in one spreadsheet and automatically create XMLs from it. So if you had a bunch of lists, parent-child lists, whatever, you could export those to Excel, run our tool, automatically generate the XMLs. Hopefully that answers your question. And it's a pleasure to have you here today. And we have, let's see, any other questions? It's the end of the webinar. Thank you for being here. We will be sending you this presentation with the links and everything. We have a very short, it's basically a questionnaire at the end. And I apologize for those of you who were here last week. I didn't get the package out on time. I just remember this morning. But we will get that out sooner this time. And once again, like always, these webinars are posted to YouTube at the end of the day today. And if you have any questions whatsoever, don't be shy. Please reach out and contact us. We would love to hear from you. Hope you have a great day, and that's it. Talk to you soon.